The gaslight flickered against the grimy windows of Dr. Edmund Hartwell's Whitechapel clinic as screams echoed from the basement below. London, 1888, a city already terrorized by the Ripper's blade, had no idea that something far more sinister lurked behind the respectable doors of Harley Street. Dr. James Morrison thought he was making a routine house call to examine his colleague's ailing wife. Instead, he found Eleanor Hartwell strapped to a surgical table, her limbs grotesquely twisted, her spine deliberately curved into an inhuman arch. But Eleanor was alive, conscious, and grateful. What Morrison discovered next would haunt him forever. Eleanor wasn't Hartwell's first victim. She was his willing participant. Hidden in Morrison's past was his own dark secret. He'd once been expelled from medical school for refusing to participate in illegal human experimentation. Now, 20 years later, he was the only man in London qualified to understand the true horror of what Hartwell had achieved. With Scotland Yard closing in and bodies piling up, Morrison faced an impossible choice: expose the truth and destroy London's faith in medicine forever, or become complicit in the most twisted medical conspiracy in history. But what if Eleanor Hartwell wasn't human at all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Morrison's hands trembled as he set down his medical bag on the damp stone floor. The basement reeked of carbolic acid and something else, something organic and wrong. Eleanor's eyes tracked his movement with an intelligence that chilled him more than her physical condition. "Dr. Morrison," she whispered, her voice carrying an odd musical quality despite her obvious pain. "How kind of you to visit. Edmund has told me so much about your principles." The word dripped with mockery. Morrison forced himself to step closer, his physician's training warring with every instinct screaming at him to flee. Eleanor's spine had been systematically broken and reset, creating curves that belonged on no human form. Yet somehow, impossibly, she was not only alive but appeared to be thriving. "What has he done to you?" Morrison breathed. Eleanor's laugh was like breaking glass. "Done to me? Oh dear doctor, you misunderstand entirely. Edmund has done this for me. This body, this magnificent reconstruction, is exactly what I requested." Footsteps echoed from the stairs behind them. Dr. Hartwell descended slowly, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. Blood stained his shirt cuffs, and his eyes held a fevered brightness that Morrison recognized from his darkest days at medical school. "James," Hartwell said, his voice unnaturally calm. "I wasn't expecting you quite so early, though perhaps it's for the best. We have much to discuss." Morrison backed toward the stairs, but Hartwell's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. Now, don't be hasty. You haven't seen the most remarkable part yet." The basement stretched further than Morrison had initially realized. Gas lamps illuminated a series of surgical stations, each equipped with restraints and instruments he didn't recognize. On the nearest table lay what appeared to be a human torso, though the proportions were all wrong, too long, with additional joints visible beneath the pale skin. "My God, Edmund, what is this place?" "Progress," Hartwell replied simply, "though I suppose someone with your squeamish constitution might call it something else." Morrison's expulsion from Edinburgh Medical College 20 years prior flashed through his memory. He'd walked away from a promising career rather than participate in Professor Blackwood's experiments on the poor and desperate. The official records claimed he'd failed his examinations, but Morrison knew the truth. He'd seen what happened to those who volunteered for Blackwood's procedures. Most never left the college alive. "You're continuing Blackwood's work," Morrison said, the pieces falling into place. Eleanor's head turned toward them with a movement too fluid for her reconstructed spine. "Not continuing, dear doctor. Perfecting." "James, you of all people should understand," Hartwell continued, leading him deeper into the basement. "Medical science stagnates under conventional morality. While surgeons debate ethics, people suffer. Eleanor came to me dying of consumption, wasting away to nothing. Look at her now." Morrison looked, Eleanor's chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, but there was no sign of the disease that should have claimed her months ago. Her skin held an unusual pallor, almost luminescent in the gaslight. "How many others?" Morrison asked. "7 successful transformations so far. 3 failures." Hartwell's voice held no remorse, though I prefer to think of them as valuable learning experiences. A metal door at the far end of the basement stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, Morrison glimpsed movement, something pale and twisted writhing in the shadows beyond. "The police are asking questions," Morrison said quietly. "Bodies have been found in the Thames, surgically altered. It won't be long before they trace the work back to someone with advanced anatomical knowledge." Hartwell smiled. "Yes, I'm aware. Which is precisely why I need your help, old friend. Your reputation is beyond reproach. Your word carries weight with both Scotland Yard and the Royal College of Surgeons." Eleanor's voice drifted across the basement, sweet and terrible. "Join us, Dr. Morrison. Help us show the world what humanity can become." Morrison stared into her eyes and realized with growing horror that whatever looked back at him was no longer entirely human. The gaslight flickered against the rain-streaked windows of Dr. Edmund Blackwood's study as he poured himself a third brandy. The amber liquid did little to wash away the metallic taste that had lingered in his mouth since leaving Whitmore's laboratory 3 days prior. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, that poor woman strapped to the table, her flesh bearing the unmistakable marks of surgical intervention gone horribly wrong. A sharp rap at his door interrupted his brooding. His housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, appeared with her usual stern expression. "Dr. Whitmore to see you, sir. Says it's urgent." Blackwood's blood chilled. "Show him in." Whitmore entered with his characteristic confidence, though something predatory gleamed in his pale eyes tonight. His perfectly pressed evening wear suggested he'd come directly from some social engagement, yet his hands bore the telltale stains that no amount of scrubbing could entirely remove. "Edmund, my dear fellow, you look positively ghastly." Whitmore settled into the leather chair opposite without invitation. "Perhaps you've been dwelling too much on what you witnessed in my laboratory." "What I witnessed was butchery." Blackwood set down his brandy with deliberate care. "That woman, your wife, what have you done to her?" Whitmore's laugh was soft, almost musical. "Done to her? My dear Edmund, you misunderstand entirely. What I've done is transcendent, revolutionary. I've moved beyond the crude limitations of conventional medicine into something far more profound. She was conscious. I saw her eyes. Yes, wasn't it remarkable? Complete awareness during procedures that would normally require unconsciousness. The human mind, you see, is far more adaptable than we've ever imagined. Pain, Edmund, is merely another frontier to be conquered." Blackwood felt his stomach lurch. "You're speaking of torture." "I'm speaking of evolution." Whitmore leaned forward, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "Tell me, what do you know of the Vesalius Society?" The name struck Blackwood like a physical blow. He'd heard whispers, rumors of an exclusive circle of physicians and anatomists who pushed the boundaries of medical ethics. Most dismissed it as fantasy, the fevered imaginings of those jealous of their betters' success. "I see you recognize the name." Whitmore's smile widened. "We've been watching you, Edmund. Your surgical precision, your innovative techniques, your flexible approach to certain regulations. The society believes you might be ready for advancement. I want nothing to do with your society or your barbarism." "Barbarism?" Whitmore stood, moving to examine the medical texts lining Blackwood's shelves. "How many patients have died under your knife, Edmund? How many times have you stood helpless as disease-ravaged bodies you'd sworn to heal? We offer something different, the power to remake the human form entirely, to push past the pathetic limitations of flesh and bone." "At what cost?" "Cost?" Whitmore pulled a leather portfolio from his coat. "Let me show you what we've achieved." The photographs he spread across Blackwood's desk defied comprehension. Human forms twisted into impossible configurations, limbs relocated with surgical precision, faces bearing modifications that seemed to serve no medical purpose. Yet the subjects appeared alive, more than alive. Their eyes held an intensity that was almost luminous. "This is madness," Blackwood whispered. "This is progress." The society has patrons throughout London's highest circles, members of Parliament, industry titans, even certain members of the royal household. They provide us with resources and protection in exchange for services. What kind of services? Whitmore's smile grew cold. Some wish to enhance themselves, others require problems solved discreetly. A political rival who suffers an unfortunate accident, perhaps, or a troublesome journalist who simply disappears. Our skills extend far beyond the operating theatre. Blackwood pushed the photographs away, but the images remained burned in his memory. "And if I refuse your invitation?" "Refuse." Whitmore gathered the materials with casual efficiency. "My dear Edmund, you've already seen too much to simply walk away. Besides, I think you'll find your circumstances about to become rather pressing." Before Blackwood could respond, Whitmore was moving toward the door. He paused at the threshold, adjusting his gloves with meticulous care. "Oh, I nearly forgot. You might find tomorrow's morning papers rather interesting. Something about irregularities in your patient records, a suggestion that certain experimental procedures were conducted without proper authorization. The medical board takes such allegations quite seriously, I'm told." The implied threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Blackwood understood with crystal clarity that his career, his reputation, everything he'd built over decades of careful work, now balanced on a knife's edge. "The society meets tomorrow evening, Millbank Penitentiary, the abandoned East Wing. Come alone and come prepared to see the true future of medicine." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Blackwood alone with his racing thoughts and the lingering scent of carbolic acid that seemed to follow Whitmore like a shadow. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault on the windows, and somewhere in the darkness, London's secrets writhed like living things. The gaslight flickered against the grimy windows of the Crown and Anchor as Edmund pushed through the tavern's heavy oak door. The acrid smell of gin and unwashed bodies assaulted his senses, a stark contrast to the sterile corridors of St. Bartholomew's. He had chosen this establishment precisely for its anonymity. No respectable physician would be caught dead in such a place. Inspector Caldwell sat hunched over a pewter mug in the far corner, his weathered face partially obscured by shadow. Edmund recognized him immediately from their brief correspondence following the Whitmore case, a series of peculiar deaths that had raised uncomfortable questions about certain medical practices in the city. "Dr. Ashford." Caldwell's voice carried the gravel of too many years breathing London's poisoned air. "You look as though you've seen a ghost." Edmund slid onto the rough wooden bench across from the inspector, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them flat on the scarred table. "Perhaps I have. What I witnessed tonight—" He paused, struggling to find words that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a madman. Caldwell leaned forward, his grey eyes sharp with interest. "Your message mentioned Dr. Blackwood. I've been waiting 3 years for someone to come forward about that man." 3 years? Edmund's voice cracked. "You mean others have suspected—" "Suspected is putting it mildly." Caldwell reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, its edges worn from handling. 7 unexplained deaths in the past 18 months, all patients of Blackwood or his associates, all showing signs of unusual medical intervention. Edmund's stomach lurched as Caldwell opened the portfolio, revealing a collection of police sketches and photographs. The images were disturbing, bodies bearing surgical incisions that followed no known medical procedure, organs removed with surgical precision, yet for no discernible therapeutic purpose. Mary Peterson, aged 32, found in the Thames with her skull opened and brain tissue missing. Caldwell's finger traced the outline of a photograph. Thomas Wickham, 28. discovered in his lodgings with his spine exposed and vertebrae removed in a perfect sequence. Dear God. Edmund pushed the photographs away, but Caldwell caught his wrist. Look at them, Doctor. Really look. The inspector's grip was firm. Tell me what you see. Fighting down his revulsion, Edmund forced himself to examine the images more carefully. Gradually, a horrifying pattern began to emerge. The incisions were too clean, too purposeful for random violence. Each showed evidence of advanced surgical knowledge, the work of someone intimately familiar with human anatomy. These weren't killed by some madman with a knife, Edmund whispered. These are surgical procedures. Precisely. But procedures for what purpose? Caldwell gathered the photographs back into his portfolio. Every victim was young, healthy, with no known medical conditions requiring such extreme intervention. And here's what troubles me most. They all disappeared from their homes voluntarily. Neighbors reported seeing them leave of their own accord, often in the company of well-dressed gentlemen. Edmund thought of what he had witnessed in Blackwood's laboratory, the systematic nature of the experimentation, the careful documentation, the expensive equipment. This wasn't the work of a single deranged physician. The scope suggested something far more organized. There's something else, Caldwell continued, lowering his voice. 3 of these victims had connections to St. Bartholomew's, either as former patients or through family members who worked there. And in each case, their medical records vanished from the hospital's files after their deaths. A chill ran down Edmund's spine as he recalled the ledger he had glimpsed in Blackwood's study, pages upon pages of meticulous notes documenting procedures on living subjects. How many names had been recorded in those pages? How many victims had he failed to count in his horror? Inspector, what I saw tonight confirms your worst suspicions. Edmund kept his voice barely above a whisper. Blackwood has converted the basement of his home into a fully equipped surgical theater. His wife, God help me, his own wife is strapped to a table, conscious and aware while he performs experiments on her living brain. Caldwell's face went pale. You're certain she was alive? Her eyes followed my movement. She tried to speak. The memory threatened to overwhelm him again. But Inspector, there's something else. Something that suggests this conspiracy reaches far beyond one mad surgeon. Edmund described the quality of the equipment he had observed, the specialized instruments that would cost more than most physicians earned in a lifetime. He recounted the careful documentation, the systematic approach that spoke of institutional support rather than individual madness. Someone is funding this research, he concluded. Someone with considerable resources and influence. The question is why? Caldwell nodded grimly. I've had similar thoughts, but proving it will require evidence, real evidence that will stand up in court, and that means getting inside that house again. Edmund's blood turned cold at the suggestion. The thought of returning to that chamber of horrors filled him with dread, but the image of Mrs. Blackwood's pleading eyes haunted him. How many others were suffering while he sat in safety? What exactly are you proposing, Inspector? Caldwell smiled, but there was no warmth in it. That we pay Dr. Blackwood an official visit. Tomorrow night. The hansom cab rattled through the fog-shrouded streets as Dr. Edmund Blackwood clutched the leather satchel containing Margaret Ashford's medical records. Each bump in the cobblestones sent a jolt through his already frayed nerves. The images from that basement laboratory burned into his memory like acid on glass. The woman's pleading eyes haunted him, but it was the methodical precision of those surgical modifications that truly chilled his blood. Harley Street, he called to the driver, his voice barely audible over the clatter of hooves. He needed answers, and there was only one man who might provide them without asking too many questions. Dr. Cornelius Webb had been Blackwood's mentor during his early years at St. Bartholomew's, a brilliant anatomist whose unconventional theories had earned him both acclaim and suspicion from the Royal College of Surgeons. If anyone would understand the significance of what Ashford was attempting, it would be Webb. The cab drew to a halt before a narrow townhouse squeezed between 2 larger medical practices. Blackwood paid the driver and hurried up the steps, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter November air. The brass nameplate beside the door had tarnished to an unreadable green, but he knew he was in the right place. Webb answered on the third knock, his wild grey hair even more dishevelled than usual. "Edmund, good Lord, you look as though you've seen a ghost." He peered through wire-rimmed spectacles, his pale blue eyes immediately alert. Come in before the neighbours start talking." The interior of Webb's home reflected his eccentric nature. Anatomical charts covered every wall, and specimen jars lined the shelves like grotesque decorations. The smell of formaldehyde hung heavy in the air, mixed with the earthier scent of old books and pipe tobacco. "I need to show you something," Blackwood said without preamble, setting the satchel on a cleared section of Webb's cluttered desk. "But first, I must have your word that what I'm about to reveal will remain in absolute confidence." Webb's eyebrows rose, but he nodded gravely. "You have it, my boy. Now, what's got you in such a state?" Blackwood withdrew the photographs first, his hands trembling slightly as he laid them out. Webb leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles, and his expression transformed from curiosity to horror to fascination in the span of seconds. "Dear God," Webb whispered, reaching for his magnifying glass. "These incisions, the precision. Edmund, where did you obtain these? That's not important right now. What matters is what you can tell me about the procedures themselves." Webb studied each photograph with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. His breathing grew more labored as he moved from image to image, occasionally making small sounds of disbelief. "This is impossible," he finally said, setting down the magnifying glass with shaking hands. "The human nervous system simply cannot accommodate modifications of this magnitude. The patient would die from shock long before—" He stopped abruptly, his face paling. "Edmund, please tell me these are theoretical models, perhaps cadaver work for research purposes." Blackwood's silence was answer enough. Webb sank into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. "Who is conducting these experiments?" "Dr. Victor Ashford." "Ashford?" Webb's voice cracked. "But he's one of the most respected surgeons in London. He's addressed the Royal Society, published extensively on surgical innovations." He trailed off, pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place. His wife. There were rumors about her condition, her prolonged illness. Blackwood nodded grimly. "She's alive, Cornelius. I've seen her. Whatever Ashford has done, she's survived it." Webb stood abruptly and began pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. "If what you're showing me is genuine, then Ashford has achieved something that should be medically impossible. The neural pathways alone." He stopped and fixed Blackwood with an intense stare. "There are theories, Edmund, whispered discussions among certain circles about the true nature of consciousness, about the possibility of enhancement." Enhancement? The idea that human capabilities could be expanded beyond their natural limitations through surgical intervention. Most of us dismissed it as fantasy, the ravings of men who read too much Gothic fiction. Webb's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But if Ashford has actually succeeded—" A heavy knock at the front door interrupted them. Both men froze, listening as the sound came again, deliberate, authoritative. "Were you followed?" Webb hissed. Blackwood felt his blood turn to ice. He'd been so focused on reaching Webb that he hadn't considered the possibility of surveillance. The knocking continued, growing more insistent. Webb quickly gathered the photographs, shoving them back into the satchel. "The back entrance," he whispered urgently, "through the garden. And Edmund, whatever you do, don't return to your practice tonight. If they know you've seen those images—" The front door shuddered under renewed pounding, and somewhere in the distance, Blackwood could swear he heard the measured footsteps of multiple men approaching through the fog. The fog had lifted by the time I reached Harrington's estate in Belgravia, but the chill in my bones remained. The Georgian mansion loomed against the pale morning sky, its windows dark and unwelcoming. I had rehearsed my approach during the carriage ride, settling on the pretense of a professional consultation. After all, colleagues often sought second opinions on difficult cases. The butler who answered my knock was a gaunt man with hollow eyes that seemed to peer straight through me. "Dr. Harrington is not receiving visitors today, sir." "Dr. Edmund Blackwood," I said, extending my card. "I believe he'll make an exception. It's regarding a rather urgent surgical matter." The man's expression flickered, just for an instant, before he stepped aside. "Please wait in the drawing room. I shall inquire if the doctor is available." The drawing room was a study in contradictions. Expensive furniture sat beneath portraits of stern ancestors, but everything felt wrong somehow. The flowers in the vase were wilted, their petals brown at the edges. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight filtering through grimy windows. Most unsettling were the medical journals scattered across the side tables. Not the respectable publications I knew, but foreign periodicals with titles in German and what appeared to be Czech. I picked up one of the journals, my German sufficient to make out the heading, Experimentelle Chirurgie und Physiologie. The accompanying illustration made my stomach turn. It depicted a human torso opened in ways that defied both anatomy and decency, with annotations suggesting procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics I held sacred. Fascinating reading, isn't it? I spun around to find Harrington in the doorway. He looked different than he had at the Royal College, thinner, with a nervous energy that set my teeth on edge. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his collar slightly askew, and his waistcoat bearing what appeared to be old stains. "Charles," I said, forcing warmth into my voice. "Thank you for seeing me." "Not at all, Edmund, though I must confess surprise at your visit. We don't often socialize, do we?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. "What brings you to my humble abode?" I set down the journal carefully. "I've been wrestling with a particularly complex case, a patient with severe abdominal trauma, and I recalled your innovative approaches to internal surgery. I hoped you might offer some insight." "Ah." Something shifted in his expression, a predatory interest that made my skin crawl. "Internal work, you say?" "Yes, I've been exploring new territories in that regard. Please, describe the case." I fabricated details as convincingly as possible, watching his reactions. He leaned forward as I spoke, occasionally interjecting with questions that grew increasingly specific and disturbing. When I mentioned the fictional patient's age and gender, a young woman of 25, his pupils dilated noticeably. "Most intriguing," he murmured when I finished. "You know, Edmund, I've been developing techniques that go far beyond what they teach at the Royal College. The human body is capable of such remarkable adaptations when properly encouraged. Encouraged? Come now. Surely you've wondered what lies beyond the boundaries of conventional medicine. What might be possible if we freed ourselves from the shackles of tradition?" He stood abruptly and began pacing. "The Germans are making extraordinary advances. They understand that true progress requires sacrifice." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "What sort of sacrifice?" Before he could answer, a sound echoed through the house, a low, keening wail that raised every hair on my body. It was distinctly human, yet wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The sound of someone in agony, but distorted, as if the very vocal cords producing it had been altered. Harrington froze mid-step. "Forgive me, that's my wife. She's been quite unwell. Perhaps I could examine her?" "Professional courtesy." "Absolutely not." The vehemence in his voice was startling. "Her condition is far too delicate for additional consultation. I'm treating her myself." The wailing came again, longer this time, and I distinctly heard it echoing from somewhere below us. The basement, perhaps, or some subterranean level I hadn't known existed. "Charles," I said carefully, "that doesn't sound like any illness I'm familiar with. Are you certain?" "I think you should leave." His transformation was complete now, the mask of civility falling away entirely. "Your consultation has been noted, but I believe I can manage my case without further assistance." I stood slowly, every instinct screaming at me to flee while maintaining the pretense of normalcy. "Of course. If you change your mind." He was already moving toward the door. "James will show you out." The gaunt butler materialized as if summoned by telepathy, and I found myself being escorted rather forcefully toward the front entrance. As we passed a particular hallway, I caught a glimpse of a door that didn't belong. Heavy oak reinforced with iron bands, the kind used for wine cellars or storage rooms requiring absolute security, or laboratories where screams needed to be contained. The carriage wheels clattered against cobblestone as Dr. Edmund Blackwood peered through the rain-streaked window at the imposing facade of the Royal College of Surgeons. The Gothic Revival architecture loomed through the fog like a monument to medical authority, its stone gargoyles appearing to leer down at him with knowing expressions. He clutched the leather satchel containing Margaret's tissue samples tighter against his chest. Inside the college's dimly lit corridors, the familiar scent of carbolic acid and old leather-bound volumes should have provided comfort. Instead, every shadow seemed to harbor secrets. Every whispered conversation between colleagues felt loaded with hidden meaning. Blackwood's footsteps echoed as he made his way toward the laboratory wing, nodding curtly to the few physicians he encountered. Dr. Alistair Henley looked up from his microscope as Blackwood entered the pathology laboratory. The elderly man's wire-rimmed spectacles caught the gaslight, creating twin circles of reflected flame that obscured his eyes momentarily. "Edmund, my dear fellow, you look positively haggard. Another difficult surgery?" "Something like that." Blackwood set his satchel on the marble-topped examination table. "Alistair, I need your expertise on a rather unusual case. Complete discretion, you understand." Henley's bushy eyebrows rose with interest. In their 20-year friendship, Blackwood had never requested such secrecy. Of course, professional confidence is sacred, as you well know. As Blackwood carefully extracted the preserved tissue samples, he watched Henley's face transform from curiosity to bewilderment, then to something approaching horror. The older man's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his microscope to examine the specimens. "Good God, Edmund, what manner of pathology produces such aberrations?" Henley's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "This tissue exhibits characteristics I've never encountered. The cellular structure appears almost engineered." "Engineered?" Blackwood leaned closer, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" "Observe here." Henley gestured to the microscope. "The muscle fibers show signs of deliberate modification. This isn't disease, nor is it natural variation. Someone has been experimenting on living tissue with a precision that defies current medical understanding." Blackwood's blood chilled as he peered through the eyepiece. Even with his limited pathological knowledge, he could see the unnatural patterns Henley described. The tissue looked wrong, as if someone had been attempting to redesign human anatomy itself. "There's something else," Henley continued, his voice grave. "I've seen similar specimens before." "Where?" 3 months ago, Dr. Pemberton, from St. Bartholomew's, brought me samples exhibiting nearly identical characteristics. He claimed they were from a cadaver donated for research, but when I inquired further, he became evasive and ultimately withdrew the specimens. The name Pemberton struck Blackwood like a physical blow. He was one of Whitmore's closest associates, a man who had dined at the Blackwood home on numerous occasions. The web of connections was expanding, drawing in men he had known and trusted for years. "Alistair, I must ask you not to document this examination. Not yet." Henley studied his friend's face with growing concern. "Edmund, if these samples represent evidence of human experimentation, we have a moral obligation to..." "To what? Alert the authorities based on tissue samples of unknown origin?" Blackwood's voice carried a desperate edge. "We need more evidence before we make accusations that could destroy careers and reputations." The truth was more complex than Blackwood dared reveal. If Whitmore's experiments were part of a larger conspiracy involving respected members of the medical establishment, rushing to authorities might only serve to warn the guilty and destroy evidence. He needed to understand the scope of what he was dealing with before taking any irreversible steps. Henley reluctantly agreed to maintain silence. but his parting words followed Blackwood into the fog-shrouded London evening. "Whatever you're investigating, Edmund, be careful. Men capable of this level of innovation are not likely to be deterred by conventional moral constraints." The return journey to his Belgravia home felt interminable. Every gaslight seemed dimmer, every pedestrian potentially threatening. Blackwood found himself studying the faces of passers-by, wondering how many others might be involved in whatever unholy enterprise Whitmore was conducting. As his carriage pulled up to his front door, Blackwood noticed a figure in a dark overcoat standing beneath a street lamp across the square. The man's face remained obscured, but something about his posture suggested focused attention rather than casual loitering. When Blackwood looked again after paying his driver, the figure had vanished. Inside his study, surrounded by medical texts and anatomical drawings that had once represented the noble pursuit of healing knowledge, Blackwood poured himself a generous measure of brandy. His hands shook slightly as he raised the glass, the amber liquid catching the firelight like liquid flame. The evidence was undeniable now. Someone was conducting experiments on human subjects with a sophistication that challenged everything he understood about the limitations of medical science. The question that haunted him as he stared into the dancing flames was not whether such experiments were taking place, but how many victims they had claimed, and how high the conspiracy reached into the ranks of London's medical elite. The gaslight flickered against the grimy windows of the Royal College of Physicians as Dr. Edmund Blackwood made his way through the dimly lit corridors. His footsteps echoed hollowly on the marble floors, each sound seeming to mock his growing sense of unease. 3 days had passed since his horrific discovery in Pemberton's basement, yet sleep continued to elude him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Margaret's tortured face, heard her pitiful whimpers. He had spent those sleepless nights poring over medical journals, searching for any precedent, any explanation for what he had witnessed. The transformation of human tissue, the impossible regeneration, it defied every principle of natural science he had spent decades studying. Yet the evidence burned in his memory with undeniable clarity. Tonight's emergency council meeting had been called under the pretense of discussing new surgical techniques, but Blackwood suspected a darker purpose. The hastily scrawled invitation had arrived that morning bearing the seal of Dr. Cornelius Ashford, the college's most influential member and longtime friend of Pemberton. As he approached the mahogany doors of the council chamber, voices drifted through the heavy wood. He recognized Ashford's patrician drawl immediately, but there were others, voices that made his blood run cold. Pemberton was inside. Blackwood pressed his ear to the door, straining to catch fragments of conversation. The Blackwood situation grows more problematic by the day. He's asking questions, making inquiries. Perhaps it's time he learned the truth of our work. The voices fell silent. Blackwood stepped back just as the door swung open, revealing Dr. Ashford's gaunt frame silhouetted against the warm lamplight within. "Edmund, my dear fellow, do come in. We've been expecting you." The chamber was smaller than Blackwood remembered, its walls lined with portraits of distinguished physicians, whose dead eyes seemed to follow his movement. Around the oval table sat 6 men, each one a pillar of London's medical establishment. At the far end, Pemberton lounged in his chair with the casual confidence of a man who held all the cards. "Gentlemen," Ashford began, his fingers steepled before him, "Dr. Blackwood has stumbled upon something rather sensitive. I believe it's time we brought him into our confidence." Blackwood's throat tightened. "I want no part of whatever madness you've involved yourselves in. What Pemberton has done to his wife is an abomination." "Is it?" The voice belonged to Dr. Mortimer Grimsby, whose work on anatomy had made him famous throughout Europe. "Or is it the next step in human evolution?" Pemberton leaned forward, his eyes glinting with fervor. "Tell me, Edmund, what did you see in my laboratory? Really see, beyond your initial revulsion?" Against his better judgment, Blackwood found himself answering. "Tissue regeneration. Impossible healing. Margaret's arm. It grew back before my eyes." "Precisely." Ashford's smile was cold as winter fog. "We have unlocked the secret of cellular reconstruction, Edmund. We have conquered death itself." The words hung in the air like poison. Blackwood gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. At what cost? The woman is barely human anymore. She's become some sort of what? Pemberton's voice cracked like a whip. A miracle? A testament to the power of science over nature's limitations? Dr. Reginald Thornbury, a nervous man with thinning hair, cleared his throat. "The process does require refinement. The early subjects experienced certain psychological deterioration." "Subjects?" Blackwood's voice rose. "How many? How many people have you butchered in the name of this obscenity?" 12 successful transformations," Ashford replied matter-of-factly, "though I prefer to think of them as pioneers, the first citizens of a new age where disease, injury, even death itself holds no dominion." The room began to spin. Blackwood thought of all the missing persons reports he'd read in the papers, all the unexplained disappearances from London's poorest quarters. "You're harvesting people, using them as test subjects. The homeless, the destitute, the forgotten," Grimsby said with a dismissive wave. "Society's refuse, given purpose at last. Their sacrifice paves the way for immortality itself." Pemberton stood, his movements fluid and predatory. "We offered you a place at this table once before, Edmund. Your surgical skills, your reputation, they would be invaluable to our cause. The offer still stands. And if I refuse?" The silence stretched taut as a hangman's rope. Finally, Ashford spoke, his voice soft as silk and twice as dangerous. "Then you join our collection of research materials." Blackwood's hand moved instinctively toward the door, but 2 orderlies had appeared as if from nowhere, blocking his exit. Their faces bore the same vacant expression he had seen in Margaret's eyes, the look of those who had undergone Pemberton's unholy procedures. "Choose wisely, old friend," Pemberton whispered. "After all, the difference between colleague and specimen is merely a matter of perspective." The gas lamps flickered against the November fog as I made my way through the narrow streets of Whitechapel, my medical bag clutched tightly in my gloved hand. 3 days had passed since my horrific discovery in Blackwood's basement, and sleep had become a stranger to me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Margaret's mutilated form, heard her mechanical breathing, witnessed the unholy fusion of flesh and metal that my colleague had created. I had come to this wretched part of London following a lead from Inspector Morrison, who had reluctantly agreed to help me investigate the conspiracy after I showed him the photographs I'd managed to take in Blackwood's laboratory. The images were blurred and poorly lit, but they captured enough detail to convince even the most skeptical observer that something monstrous was taking place beneath the Royal London Hospital. The address Morrison had given me belonged to a woman named Sarah Kellerman, formerly a seamstress before she had married Dr. Edmund Kellerman 3 years prior. According to the inspector's sources, Dr. Kellerman had been seen entering and leaving Blackwood's residence at unusual hours, always carrying a black leather case similar to the one I now held. Mrs. Kellerman lived in a cramped tenement building that reeked of cabbage and human misery. I climbed 3 flights of creaking stairs before finding her door, marked only by the number 7 painted in fading white. When I knocked, the sound echoed through the thin walls like gunshots. "Mrs. Kellerman?" I called softly. "My name is Dr. Hartwell. I'm a colleague of your husband's. I need to speak with you about a matter of utmost importance." Silence stretched for nearly a minute before I heard the shuffle of feet and the scraping of multiple locks being undone. The door opened just wide enough to reveal a single bloodshot eye peering out at me. "Edmund's not here," she whispered, her voice carrying a peculiar mechanical quality that made my blood run cold. "He hasn't been home in 4 days. May I come in, Mrs. Kellerman? I believe your husband may be in danger." The eye studied me for another long moment before the door swung open. What I saw made me struggle to maintain my composure. Sarah Kellerman had once been a beautiful woman, judging by the delicate bone structure of her face, but now she moved with the same jerky, unnatural gait I had observed in Margaret Blackwood. Her left arm hung at an odd angle, and when she turned her head, I caught a glimpse of metal gleaming beneath the collar of her high-necked dress. "Please, sit down," she said, gesturing to a threadbare chair near the room's single window. "Forgive my appearance. I've been unwell lately." I remained standing, my physician's training warring with my growing horror as I catalogued the signs of surgical intervention. Fresh scars lined her neck, partially hidden by a silk scarf. Her movements were accompanied by faint clicking sounds, as if clockwork mechanisms were operating beneath her skin. "Mrs. Kellerman, I must ask you directly, has your husband been conducting medical procedures on you?" Her laugh was a sound I will never forget, a harsh mechanical wheeze that seemed to come from some device rather than human lungs. "Procedures? Is that what Edmund calls them? What Blackwood calls them?" She moved closer, and I could see that her eyes had been replaced with glass orbs that reflected the lamplight like a doll's. "They call it progress, Dr. Hartwell, the future of medicine, the marriage of flesh and machine." My hand instinctively moved to the pistol I had begun carrying since my encounter with Margaret. "What have they done to you?" "What they've done to all of us," she replied, beginning to unbutton her dress with fingers that moved too precisely, too mechanically. "The wives, the daughters, the women they could spirit away from the streets without anyone caring enough to look, we are their greatest achievement." As her clothing fell away, I saw the full extent of the horror. Her torso had been opened and rebuilt, ribs replaced with brass framework that housed a complex arrangement of gears and pistons. Where her heart should have been, a crystal chamber pulsed with sickly green light. Her legs were a grotesque fusion of bone and metal connected to her pelvis by intricate joint mechanisms. "They're building an army, Doctor," she continued, her voice never changing pitch or tone. "The Royal Society has grand plans for England's future. Wars fought not by men who tire and bleed and die, but by creatures like us who know no pain, no fear, no doubt." I backed toward the door, my mind reeling with the implications. "How many of you are there?" "Dozens now, perhaps hundreds soon. We gather in the tunnels beneath London waiting for our orders, waiting for the day when the Queen herself will command us to—" The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs cut her off. Sarah's mechanical eyes swiveled toward the door with inhuman precision. "They've found you, Dr. Hartwell," she whispered. "Run." The gaslight flickered against the damp brick walls as Edmund descended deeper into the bowels of St. Bartholomew's Hospital than he had ever ventured before. The official basement laboratories ended 2 floors above, but the narrow stone steps continued downward into what the hospital records claimed was merely storage space for the morgue. His leather medical bag bounced against his hip with each careful step, the familiar weight now feeling ominous in the suffocating darkness. The key Whitmore's wife had pressed into his trembling palm 3 nights ago felt like ice against his fingers. She had appeared at his door, wild-eyed and desperate, speaking in fragments about the real work happening beneath the hospital. Before he could question her further, she had vanished back into the London fog, leaving only the strange brass key and the whispered words, "Sub-basement 3. After midnight. Save them." Edmund paused at a heavy oak door marked with symbols he didn't recognize, not medical notation, but something far older. The key turned with surprising ease, as if it had been used recently and often. Beyond lay a corridor lined with doors, each bearing a small viewing window at eye level. The air carried a sweet, sickly smell that made his physician's instincts recoil in recognition. Chloroform, certainly, but underneath it something far worse, the unmistakable scent of decay and fear. He approached the first door with mounting dread. Through the tiny window, he glimpsed a figure strapped to a table, motionless but breathing. The person's head was wrapped in bandages, obscuring their features, but their body convulsed periodically, as if responding to some unseen stimulus. Edmund fumbled for his pocket watch. The convulsions came precisely every 30 seconds, far too regular to be natural. The second room contained 3 beds, each occupied by what appeared to be sleeping patients. But as Edmund watched, he realized with growing horror that their limbs moved in perfect synchronization, rising and falling as if controlled by an invisible puppeteer. Their eyes were open but vacant, staring at the ceiling with the glassy emptiness of the dead, yet their chests rose and fell with mechanical precision. His hands shook as he tried the door handle. Locked. Every door was locked except for one at the corridor's end, which stood slightly ajar. Edmund crept toward it, his heart hammering against his ribs so violently he feared it might be audible in the tomb-like silence. Inside, he found Whitmore hunched over a desk covered in journals and anatomical drawings, unlike anything in medical textbooks. The sketches depicted the human nervous system, but with additional pathways that seemed to extend beyond the body itself, connecting to strange mechanical devices and what appeared to be other human forms. Whitmore's usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his shirt sleeves rolled up and stained with substances Edmund preferred not to identify. "You shouldn't have come here," Whitmore said without turning around. His voice carried none of its usual warmth and authority. Instead, it sounded hollow, as if echoing from a great distance. "Good God, Whitmore, what is this place? What have you done to those people?" Whitmore finally turned, and Edmund stepped backward involuntarily. His colleague's face was gaunt and pale, but his eyes burned with an intensity that bordered on madness. Dark circles shadowed his features, and a thin smile played at his lips that held no trace of humanity. "Done to them. I've freed them, Edmund. Freed them from the tyranny of individual consciousness, from the burden of separate existence. They are part of something greater now, something that will reshape not just medicine, but the very nature of human experience." Edmund's gaze fell on the journals scattered across the desk. The handwriting was Whitmore's, but the diagrams and notations spoke of procedures that defied every principle of medical ethics, references to conscious suspension, network neural pathways, and collective consciousness integration filled page after page. These patients, they're not volunteers, are they? Volunteers? Whitmore laughed, a sound like glass breaking in the darkness. The poor, the desperate, the forgotten, society's refuse transformed into something magnificent. Each mind I've connected adds to the collective understanding. Soon we'll have enough subjects to begin the next phase. The next phase? Whitmore's smile widened, revealing teeth stained an unsettling shade of yellow. The integration of London's finest minds. Starting with the medical community, of course. We need practitioners who understand the human form, who can appreciate the elegance of what we're creating. Edmund backed toward the door, but Whitmore made no move to stop him. Instead, he pulled a cord hanging beside his desk, and somewhere in the depths of the basement, a bell chimed with musical precision. "You see, Edmund, you were always intended to join us. My wife's little performance, the key. Your presence here tonight, all carefully orchestrated. The collective has been quite eager to welcome your expertise in surgical procedure. Your skills will be invaluable to the network." Footsteps echoed from the corridor behind him, measured and synchronized, like soldiers marching in perfect formation. The gaslight flickered against the laboratory walls as Dr. Edmund Blackwood descended the narrow stone steps, his medical bag clutched tightly in his trembling hand. The basement of the Royal College of Physicians had always been restricted, but tonight he possessed the stolen key that would unlock its darkest secrets. Behind him, the soft footsteps of Inspector Hayes echoed in the confined space. They had agreed to investigate together after Blackwood's shocking discovery in Dr. Whitmore's private study, correspondence that implicated not just his colleague, but a network of prominent surgeons throughout London. The air grew thick with the smell of formaldehyde and something far more disturbing. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, Blackwood struck a match and lit the oil lamp he'd brought. The wavering light revealed a corridor lined with heavy wooden doors, each bearing a brass nameplate. "My God," Hayes whispered, reading the names aloud. "Sir Reginald Ashworth, Dr. Marcus Thornfield, Professor William Carruthers." These were men whose names graced hospital wings and medical journals, pillars of London's medical establishment. Blackwood tried the first door. Locked. The second yielded with a rusty groan, revealing a small chamber filled with surgical instruments he'd never seen before. devices with too many joints, blades curved at impossible angles, contraptions that seemed designed for procedures no ethical physician would attempt. In the third room, they found the journals. Hundreds of leather-bound volumes lined the walls, each meticulously catalogued by date and subject. Blackwood pulled one at random and opened it, his face growing pale as he read by lamplight. Subject 17 showed remarkable resilience to the cranial modifications, he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. The introduction of foreign neural tissue appears to enhance certain cognitive functions while suppressing others. Wife remains compliant during extended procedures. Hayes snatched the journal from his hands. This can't be real. These are respected men of science. Read on, Blackwood urged grimly. Hayes's eyes widened as he continued. Subject 17 has been informed she is recovering from a riding accident. The memory suppression techniques developed by Dr. Carruthers prove remarkably effective. She has no recollection of the procedures, though her personality has shifted dramatically toward docility and unquestioning obedience. The inspector's hands began to shake. Blackwood, are you telling me these men are experimenting on their own wives? Not just their wives. Blackwood had moved to another shelf, pulling down journal after journal. Listen to this. The homeless subjects procured from Whitechapel prove less suitable for extended study due to poor nutrition and existing disease. However, they serve adequately for testing the limits of surgical modification before applying proven techniques to more valuable subjects. A sound from deeper in the basement made them both freeze, the scraping of metal against stone, rhythmic and deliberate. Hayes drew his revolver while Blackwood raised the lamp higher. They followed the sound down another corridor, past doors marked with symbols rather than names. The scraping grew louder, accompanied now by a low humming, almost melodic in its regularity. The final door stood ajar, warm light spilling from within. Blackwood peered around the frame and immediately recoiled, pressing his hand to his mouth to stifle a cry. The chamber beyond was vast, carved deep into London's bedrock. Gas fixtures lined the walls, illuminating a scene from humanity's darkest nightmares. Dozens of surgical tables filled the space, and upon them, "Dear Christ," Hayes breathed. They were women, but barely recognizable as such. Surgical modifications had transformed them into something else entirely. Extra limbs grafted at unnatural angles, skulls opened and fitted with brass mechanisms that clicked and whirred, faces altered with additional eyes that tracked movement with disturbing awareness. At the center of the room, Dr. Whitmore stood over a fresh subject, his surgical gown pristine white despite the grotesque nature of his work. He hummed as he worked, the melody Blackwood now recognized as a popular drawing-room ballad. "Ah, Edmund," Whitmore called without looking up from his patient. "I wondered when you'd find your way down here. Rather impressive, isn't it? 3 years of careful research and development. You're mad," Blackwood managed to say. "Mad?" Whitmore finally looked up, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "My dear fellow, I'm revolutionizing medical science. Do you realize what we've accomplished here? We're creating a new form of human being. One free from the tiresome constraints of independent thought and rebellion." Hayes stepped forward, his weapon trained on Whitmore. "Dr. Whitmore, you are under arrest for..." "For what, Inspector? Advancing human knowledge? These subjects are perfectly healthy. Better than healthy, in fact. They're improved." As if responding to his voice, the modified women on the tables turned their heads in unison toward the intruders. Their multiple eyes blinked in perfect synchronization, and those with functioning vocal cords began to emit a low, harmonious moan. "You see?" Whitmore smiled proudly. "Perfect harmony, perfect obedience. The future of human evolution, guided by scientific precision rather than random chance." Blackwood realized with growing horror that the conspiracy he'd uncovered was far larger and more terrible than he'd ever imagined. The carriage wheels clattered against the cobblestones as Dr. Edmund Blackwood stared out into the fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel. Beside him, Inspector Hartwell clutched a leather satchel containing the damning photographs they had retrieved from Pemberton's laboratory. The images still burned in Edmund's mind, rows of surgical tables, each bearing what had once been human beings, now twisted into unrecognizable forms. "The Royal College meeting is in less than an hour," Hartwell murmured, checking his pocket watch. "Are you certain about this approach?" Edmund's jaw tightened. "We cannot simply burst into accusations without irrefutable proof. These men, Lord Ashford, Dr. Cranston, even the Dean himself, they wield considerable influence. One misstep and we'll be dismissed as madmen." The carriage lurched to a halt outside the imposing Georgian facade of the Royal College of Surgeons. Gas lamps flickered in the evening gloom, casting dancing shadows across the entrance, where distinguished gentlemen in top hats were already gathering for the emergency session that Pemberton had mysteriously called. As they ascended the marble steps, Edmund's mind raced through their strategy. They would observe first, listen for any hint of the conspiracy's true scope, then strike when the moment presented itself. But the weight of what they had discovered pressed upon him like a physical burden. The transformation he had witnessed in Pemberton's basement went beyond mere surgery. It suggested something far more sinister, something that challenged the very nature of life itself. The great hall buzzed with conversation as London's medical elite took their seats. Edmund recognized faces from countless professional gatherings, men he had once respected, now viewing each with suspicion. How many were complicit? How far did this web of corruption extend? Pemberton entered from a side door, his appearance startlingly composed for a man whose secret laboratory had been exposed mere hours ago. His eyes swept the assembly and lingered momentarily on Edmund before he took his position at the podium. "Gentlemen," Pemberton began, his voice carrying easily through the hall, "I have called this gathering to address certain irregularities that have come to light regarding our research initiatives." Edmund felt Hartwell tense beside him. This was not the behavior of a cornered man. Pemberton spoke with the confidence of someone still in control. "As you are aware," Pemberton continued, "our partnership with certain government entities has facilitated groundbreaking advances in surgical technique and anatomical understanding. However, it appears that some among us have developed qualms about the nature of our work." A murmur rippled through the assembly. Edmund's blood ran cold as he realized the trap they had walked into. Pemberton was not here to confess or flee, he was here to eliminate threats. "Dr. Blackwood," Pemberton's voice cut through the hall like a scalpel, "would you care to share your recent observations with your colleagues?" All eyes turned to Edmund. He rose slowly, feeling the weight of their stares, recognizing now the calculation behind many of their expressions. These were not his peers, they were his hunters. "I have indeed made observations," Edmund said, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. "I have seen what becomes of medical ethics when ambition overrides humanity. I have witnessed procedures that mock the very oath we have sworn to uphold." Lord Ashford, seated in the front row, leaned forward with predatory interest. "Strong accusations, Dr. Blackwood. I trust you have evidence to support such claims?" Hartwell's hand moved toward the satchel, but Edmund caught his wrist. Something was wrong, too wrong. The ease with which they had accessed Pemberton's laboratory, the convenient placement of those photographs, the way Pemberton seemed to anticipate their every move. "The evidence," Pemberton said with a thin smile, "is quite compelling. Dr. Blackwood has been conducting unauthorized experiments in his own home. Inspector Hartwell here has been assisting him, no doubt in exchange for access to exotic specimens." The accusation hit Edmund like a physical blow. Around the hall, faces that had shown concern now displayed disgust and condemnation. The trap was more sophisticated than he had imagined. They had been maneuvered into this position from the very beginning. "The photographs in Inspector Hartwell's possession," Pemberton continued, "will show the good doctor's handiwork. Quite disturbing, really. The Metropolitan Police have already issued a warrant for his arrest." As if summoned by his words, constables began filing into the hall from multiple entrances. Edmund's mind reeled as he understood the full scope of their manipulation. Every step they had taken, every discovery they had made, had been orchestrated to lead them here. Hartwell shot to his feet, his hand moving to his service revolver, but Edmund grabbed his arm. Violence would only confirm their supposed guilt. Instead, he looked directly at Pemberton and spoke with quiet conviction. "The truth has a way of surfacing, Doctor, even when buried beneath layers of corruption and conspiracy." Pemberton's smile widened. "Indeed it does, my dear colleague, indeed it does." The constables closed in as Edmund realized that their real battle was only just beginning. The gaslight flickered against the damp stone walls as I descended deeper into the bowels of the Royal College. Each step echoed with a hollow resonance that seemed to mock my growing dread. Behind me, Inspector Blackwood's breathing had grown labored, though whether from exertion or the same creeping horror that gripped my chest I could not say. The journal clutched in my trembling hands felt heavier with each revelation it contained. Dr. Pemberton's meticulous handwriting documented not merely the grotesque experiments I had witnessed, but something far more sinister, a systematic breeding program that had been operating beneath London's most prestigious medical institution for over 2 decades. "Good God, Harrington," Blackwood whispered as we reached the bottom of the stairs. "What manner of hell have we stumbled into?" Before us stretched a corridor lined with iron doors, each bearing a small window at eye level. The air reeked of carbolic acid and something else, something organic and wrong that made my stomach clench with revulsion. From beyond those doors came sounds that no human throat should make. I forced myself to approach the first cell, though every instinct screamed against it. Peering through the grimy glass, I saw what had once been a woman. Her limbs had been grotesquely elongated, stretched beyond natural proportion, while her torso remained unnaturally compressed. She moved with a spider-like grace that defied anatomical possibility, her eyes, too many eyes, tracking my movement with an intelligence that chilled me to the bone. "The journal mentions surgical modification of the nervous system," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "They've been altering the fundamental structure of human consciousness itself." Blackwood had moved to another cell, his face pale as death. "This one appears to have additional arms, fully functional by the look of it. How is such a thing possible?" I flipped through more pages of Pemberton's notes, my hands shaking as I read. The experiments detailed within were beyond my worst imaginings. They had discovered methods of tissue regeneration that allowed them to graft and reshape human anatomy at will, but the true horror lay not in the physical modifications, but in their purpose. "They're not creating monsters," I said, the terrible truth crystallizing in my mind. "They're creating a new species, a race of beings designed to serve the ruling class of England." The implications struck me like a physical blow. Every missing person, every unexplained disappearance from London's poorest districts, all had been feeding this monstrous enterprise. The cream of Victorian society had been funding the transformation of human beings into living tools, creatures engineered for specific purposes. A metallic clang echoed from somewhere ahead, followed by the sound of approaching footsteps. Blackwood drew his revolver while I pressed myself against the cold stone wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Dr. Harrington," came a familiar voice that made my blood freeze. "I thought I might find you here." Sir Reginald Ashworth emerged from the shadows, his silver hair gleaming in the gaslight. Behind him walked 3 figures that had once been human, but now moved with an unnatural, synchronized precision. Their faces bore the serene expression of those who had been stripped of will, of the very essence of humanity itself. "You've read Pemberton's journal, I see," Sir Reginald continued, his voice carrying the same cultured tone I had heard in drawing rooms across London. "Then you understand the magnificent scope of our achievement." "You're insane," I managed to say, though my voice cracked with terror. "This is abomination beyond measure." "Is it?" Sir Reginald smiled with genuine warmth, as if we were discussing the weather. "We have unlocked the very secrets of human modification. We can create beings of perfect obedience, of enhanced physical capability, of specialized function. The implications for the Empire are staggering. One of his companions tilted its head at an impossible angle, studying me with eyes that held no trace of human emotion. I realized with growing horror that I recognized the facial features. It had once been Lord Pemberton's wife before her transformation into something that defied classification. "The Queen herself has given her blessing to our work," Sir Reginald continued. "We are on the verge of creating a servant class that will elevate British civilization to heights undreamed of by previous generations." Blackwood raised his weapon, but I saw the futility in the gesture. Whatever these creatures had become, they moved with inhuman speed and coordination. We were trapped in this subterranean nightmare with beings that existed beyond the natural order. "You cannot stop progress, gentlemen," Sir Reginald said softly. "But you can become part of it. The transformation process has been refined considerably since these early specimens. You would retain much of your intelligence, your personality. You would simply serve a higher purpose." The creatures began to advance, their movements fluid and predatory. I clutched the journal tighter, knowing that somewhere in its pages lay evidence that could expose this conspiracy to the world, if I lived long enough to use it. The carriage wheels clattered against the cobblestones as we raced through the fog-shrouded streets toward Blackwood's estate. My hands trembled as I clutched the leather satchel containing the evidence we had gathered, photographs, journal entries, and the damning correspondence that implicated half of London's medical establishment in this monstrous conspiracy. "We should have gone to the authorities first," Margaret whispered, her face pale in the dim lamplight filtering through the carriage window. "The authorities are compromised," I replied grimly. "Commissioner Hartwell's signature was on those funding documents. We can trust no one in official positions." The carriage lurched to a halt outside the imposing iron gates of Blackwood's Manor. The driver, a man I had hired with the last of my savings, refused to venture closer to the house itself. Through the mist I could see lights burning in the basement windows, those accursed laboratories where unspeakable horrors had been perpetrated in the name of medical advancement. We approached on foot, our footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The front entrance stood unguarded, which struck me as peculiar given the sensitive nature of Blackwood's work. Margaret gripped my arm tightly as we climbed the stone steps to the heavy oak door. "Something feels wrong," she murmured. "It's too quiet." I pressed my ear against the door and heard nothing but the sound of our own breathing. When I tried the handle, it turned easily, the door swinging open with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo through the empty foyer. The house was indeed deserted, but signs of hasty departure were everywhere. Papers scattered across the floor, furniture overturned, portraits hanging askew on their hooks. We made our way carefully toward the basement, following the path I had taken during my previous clandestine visit. The laboratory doors stood wide open, and the sight that greeted us was one of complete devastation. Glass instruments lay shattered across the floor, their contents creating dark stains on the stone. The operating tables had been overturned, and the metal restraints hung loose and broken. But it was the smell that struck me most forcefully, the sweet, cloying odor of decay mixed with chemical preservatives. "Dear God!" Margaret gasped, covering her nose with her handkerchief. "What happened here?" I moved deeper into the chamber, stepping carefully around the debris. The specimen jars that had once lined the shelves were gone, leaving only empty brackets on the walls. But in the far corner, partially hidden beneath an overturned cabinet, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. It was a human hand, pale and lifeless, still bearing the distinctive ring I had seen Blackwood wear countless times at the medical society meetings. I knelt beside it, my physician's training overriding my revulsion as I examined the severed appendage. "The cuts are precise," I observed, though my voice shook slightly. "Surgical instruments were used. This wasn't the result of an accident or struggle." Margaret had discovered something equally disturbing near the abandoned chemical apparatus. A leather-bound journal, its pages singed but still partially readable. She brought it to me, her hands trembling as she pointed to a particular entry. "Look at the date," she said. "This was written yesterday." I read the spidery handwriting with growing horror. "The Council has decided that our work has become too visible. Certain sacrifices must be made to preserve the greater endeavor. I understand my role in this conclusion, though I confess I had hoped to witness the final results of our research. The specimens have been relocated to the secondary facility, and the transformation process will continue under Dr. Ashford's supervision." My heart nearly stopped at the mention of Ashford, my own mentor, the man who had guided my medical training and whom I had trusted implicitly for years. "There's more," Margaret continued, flipping to another page. "Listen to this. The surgeon Pemberton has proven more resourceful than anticipated. His investigation threatens to expose not merely our medical research, but the true purpose behind the transformations. If he cannot be persuaded to join our cause, he must be eliminated before the final phase commences." The sound of footsteps echoed from the stairway above us, heavy, deliberate steps that suggested multiple individuals approaching our location. I grabbed Margaret's hand and pulled her toward the rear of the laboratory, where I remembered seeing a second exit during my previous exploration. "We need to leave immediately," I whispered urgently. "They've returned." But as we reached the back corridor, we found our escape route blocked by a familiar figure. Dr. Ashford stood there, no longer the kindly mentor I had known, but something far more sinister. His eyes held a cold, calculating gleam, and his smile revealed teeth that seemed unnaturally sharp in the lamplight. "Hello, Thomas," he said pleasantly. "I was hoping we might have an opportunity to speak privately. There are so many things about our work that you still don't understand." Behind him, I could see other shapes moving in the shadows, figures that seemed somehow wrong in their proportions and movements. The gaslight flickered against the basement walls as Dr. Edmund Blackwood descended the narrow stone steps, his medical bag clutched tightly in his trembling hands. The sound of his colleague's voice echoed from below, punctuated by mechanical whirring that made his stomach turn. 3 days had passed since he'd discovered the truth about Dr. Harrington's midnight activities, and still the images haunted his dreams. The corridor stretched before him, lined with doors that had once seemed innocuous. Now each one represented a chamber of horrors he could barely comprehend. The metallic scent of blood mingled with the sharp bite of carbolic acid and something else, something organic and wrong that caught in his throat. "Ah, Edmund," Harrington's voice called from the depths of the laboratory. "I wondered when you'd return. Come, see what Margaret has accomplished today." Blackwood's feet moved against his will, drawn forward by a morbid fascination that warred with his revulsion. Through the doorway, he glimpsed the operating theatre that had become Harrington's obsession. Margaret Harrington lay strapped to the table, her chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. Tubes snaked from her arms to an elaborate apparatus of brass and glass that pulsed with an unnatural rhythm. But it was her eyes that made Blackwood's breath catch. They tracked his movement across the room with an intelligence that seemed both human and utterly alien. Her lips moved soundlessly, and he found himself stepping closer, despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. "She's trying to speak," he whispered. Indeed, Harrington beamed, adjusting a valve on the contraption. The vocal cords were damaged in yesterday's procedure, but the mind— oh, Edmund, the mind has transcended its earthly limitations. Watch. Harrington produced a series of cards bearing mathematical equations. As he held them before Margaret's face, her fingers began to tap against the metal restraints. The rhythm was complex, deliberate, binary. Blackwood breathed, recognizing the pattern. "She's calculating in binary." Among other things, the serum has enhanced her cognitive abilities beyond anything we dreamed possible. But that's merely the beginning. Harrington moved to a cabinet filled with glass vials, each containing a different colored fluid. "Lord Pemberton's investors are most impressed with our progress." The mention of Pemberton's name sent ice through Blackwood's veins. The man's influence extended through Parliament, the Royal College of Surgeons, even to the Crown itself. What does he want with this abomination? Abomination? Harrington laughed, the sound echoing off the stone walls. "You lack vision, old friend. We're creating the future of humanity. Imagine soldiers who feel no pain, workers who require no rest, minds capable of calculations beyond any mechanical device. The applications are limitless." A soft moan from the table drew their attention. Margaret's eyes had rolled back, exposing only the whites, and her body convulsed against the straps. The brass apparatus shrieked as pressure built within its chambers. "What's happening to her?" Blackwood demanded. Harrington rushed to the controls, his earlier confidence replaced by frantic urgency. "The neural pathways are overloading. The serum concentration may have been too high for this phase." Blackwood found himself moving without thought, his medical training overriding his horror. He checked Margaret's pulse, rapid and thready, while Harrington adjusted valves and dials. Through her thin hospital gown, he could see the network of surgical scars that crisscrossed her torso like a grotesque map of her husband's experiments. "Help me stabilize the flow," Harrington commanded. But Blackwood's attention had fixed on something else entirely. Among the surgical implements scattered across a nearby table, a letter bore the distinctive seal of the palace. His blood turned to ice as he recognized the signature at the bottom. "My God," he whispered, "the Queen knows." Harrington paused in his ministrations. "Her Majesty has been most supportive of our research. The Empire faces challenges that require unconventional solutions, foreign threats, domestic unrest. Traditional methods are insufficient." The implications crashed over Blackwood like a tide of black water. This wasn't the work of one mad surgeon, but a conspiracy reaching the very pinnacle of British society. How many others were involved? How many victims lay in basement laboratories across London? Margaret's convulsions intensified, and the machines began to emit a high-pitched whine. Sparks flew from one of the control panels as the apparatus shuddered under the strain. "She's dying," Blackwood said. "No," Harrington snarled, his composure finally cracking. "She's evolving. Margaret, my dear, stay with us. Fight through the transition." But even as he spoke, the light was fading from her eyes. The mechanical breathing slowed, then stopped entirely. In the sudden silence, Blackwood could hear his own heart hammering against his ribs. Harrington stood frozen beside his wife's corpse, his face a mask of grief and fury. When he finally looked up at Blackwood, his expression had transformed into something cold and calculating. "You understand, of course, that you cannot leave here, not with what you've witnessed." The carriage wheels clattered against the cobblestones as Dr. Edmund Blackwood pressed himself deeper into the shadows of the hansom cab. His hands trembled as he clutched the leather satchel containing the damning evidence he'd stolen from Harrington's laboratory. Photographs, surgical notes, and most horrifying of all, tissue samples that defied every natural law he'd ever studied. The fog had grown thicker since his escape, swirling through London's streets like the breath of some enormous malevolent beast. Gas lamps flickered weakly through the gloom, casting dancing shadows that seemed to reach for him with grasping fingers. Every face he glimpsed in the murk could belong to one of them, the conspiracy that reached from the basement laboratories to the very throne itself. "Stop here," he called to the driver as they approached St. Bartholomew's Hospital. He needed allies, and there was only one person left he could trust completely. Dr. Margaret Whitmore had been his student once, brilliant and uncompromising in her pursuit of truth. If anyone could help him expose this nightmare, it would be her. The hospital corridors were nearly empty at this late hour, save for the occasional nurse making her rounds. Blackwood's footsteps echoed hollowly as he made his way to the research wing, where Margaret often worked through the night. He found her hunched over a microscope, her auburn hair catching the lamplight as she peered into the eyepiece. "Edmund?" She looked up in surprise, then alarm as she took in his disheveled appearance. "Good God, what's happened to you?" "Margaret, I need you to look at something. But first you must promise me that what I'm about to show you will remain between us until we can determine the proper course of action." Her green eyes studied his face carefully. "You're frightening me. What sort of trouble are you in?" Instead of answering, He opened the satchel and withdrew one of the tissue samples, a section of what appeared to be human muscle, but with an unnatural, iridescent quality that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Margaret's breath caught as she examined it. "This is impossible," she whispered, adjusting the microscope's focus. "The cellular structure, it's as if it's been completely rewritten. How is this alive without a circulatory system?" "That's only the beginning." Blackwood spread the photographs across her desk, images of Harrington's basement laboratory, the grotesque surgical procedures, the things that had once been human but were now something else entirely. Margaret's face grew pale as she absorbed each horrific detail. "These experiments, they're not random acts of madness," he explained. "There's a pattern, a purpose. Harrington and his associates are trying to create something, a new form of life that can survive without the limitations of normal human physiology. But the cost," he gestured to a photograph showing rows of failed subjects, their bodies twisted into impossible shapes. Margaret set down the last photograph with shaking hands. The Royal Medical Society's recent funding increases, the new research grants that came with so few questions asked. "Dear God, Edmund, how many of them are involved?" "More than we can count. I've seen correspondence that suggests this reaches to the highest levels of government. They believe they're creating the future of humanity, beings that can survive plague, starvation, even death itself. But they're wrong. What they're creating isn't human anymore." A sound in the corridor made them both freeze, footsteps, deliberate and measured, approaching the laboratory. Blackwood quickly gathered the evidence, shoving it back into the satchel as the door creaked open. Dr. Harrington stepped into the room, flanked by two men in dark coats, whose faces Blackwood didn't recognize. But their eyes held the same cold calculation he'd seen in the laboratory subjects, those who had survived the process, but lost something essential in the transformation. "My dear Edmund," Harrington said, his voice carrying a note of disappointment, "you've caused us considerable trouble tonight. Did you really think you could simply walk away from what you've learned?" Margaret moved closer to Blackwood, her hand finding his arm. "We can expose all of this. The medical community, the press, they have a right to know what you're doing." Harrington smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "I'm afraid that's no longer possible. You see, Dr. Whitmore, you've both seen too much, but perhaps you might be willing to contribute to our work in a more direct fashion." The two men stepped forward, and Blackwood saw the syringes they carried, filled with the same luminescent fluid he'd observed in the laboratory. His mind raced, calculating distances to the door, weapons within reach, any possible means of escape. "The next phase of human evolution cannot be stopped," Harrington continued. "You can either join us willingly, or you can join us regardless. The choice, such as it is, remains yours." Blackwood's hand closed around a heavy brass microscope, while Margaret quietly reached for the chemical cabinet behind her. Whatever happened next, they would not submit to becoming part of this monstrous experiment. The fog pressed against the windows like eager spectators, waiting to witness the next act in this theater of horrors. The gaslight flickered against the damp brick walls as Edmund descended deeper into the bowels of the Royal College. His footsteps echoed through corridors he had never known existed, each turn revealing another passage that seemed to burrow further into London's ancient foundations. The air grew thick with the smell of carbolic acid and something far more disturbing, the sweet, cloying scent of decay masked by chemical preservation. Behind him, Inspector Hartwell's breathing had grown labored, though whether from exertion or growing dread, Edmund could not say. The map they had found in Blackwood's study proved accurate, leading them through a maze of forgotten tunnels that connected the college to buildings throughout Harley Street and beyond. "How long has this been going on?" Hartwell whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant hum of machinery that grew stronger with each step. Edmund paused at an intersection, consulting the cryptic notations on Blackwood's diagram. "Decades, I suspect, perhaps longer." His finger traced the intricate network of passages. "Look at this. They connect to the morgue at Guy's Hospital, the anatomy theatre at Bart's, even beneath Parliament itself." The inspector's face paled in the gaslight. "Parliament?" The Society's influence runs deeper than we imagined. Edmund folded the map and pressed forward down the left passage. What we witnessed in Blackwood's laboratory was merely one branch of a vast tree. The mechanical humming intensified, accompanied now by the rhythmic hiss of steam and the occasional clank of metal on metal. Electric lights began to supplement the gas fixtures, casting harsh shadows that danced with their movement. The walls here were newer, lined with white tile that gleamed with an antiseptic sheen. Edmund's medical bag felt heavier with each step, weighted down not just with instruments, but with the morphine he had prepared. If they found Margaret Blackwood, if she still lived, he feared what condition she might be in after months of her husband's ministrations. A door stood ajar ahead, yellow light spilling into the corridor. Edmund raised his hand, signaling Hartwell to stop. Through the crack, they could hear voices, calm, professional, discussing their work with a detached tone of surgeons during routine operations. The neural pathway integration shows remarkable stability, came a voice Edmund recognized as Dr. Ashford from the college's anatomy department. The subject maintains consciousness throughout the procedure. Excellent, replied another voice, this one unfamiliar. Lord Pemberton will be most pleased. His wife's condition has been deteriorating rapidly. Edmund's blood chilled. Lord Pemberton, one of the most powerful men in Parliament, whose wife had been suffering from what the newspapers described as a wasting disease. He pressed closer to the door, straining to hear more. When can we schedule the transfer? Ashford continued. The donor vessel is reaching optimal conditioning. Within the week, Dr. Blackwood's preliminary work has exceeded our expectations. The consciousness remains intact even after complete cerebral relocation. Hartwell grabbed Edmund's arm, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. They were discussing the transfer of human consciousness, transplanting minds from one body to another. The implications crashed over Edmund like a tide of revulsion. The wealthy and powerful, facing death or disease, were purchasing new bodies from the poor and desperate. The conversation inside shifted, footsteps approaching the door. Edmund pulled Hartwell back into an alcove just as Dr. Ashford emerged, followed by a tall, angular man in an expensive coat. They walked past without glancing in their direction, their voices fading as they disappeared down another corridor. Edmund waited several heartbeats before moving to the door. The room beyond was a surgical theatre, unlike anything he had ever seen. Banks of electrical apparatus lined the walls, their copper coils and glass tubes pulsing with an otherworldly energy. In the center, two operating tables were positioned side by side, connected by an elaborate mechanism of wires, tubes, and gleaming metal instruments. On one table lay the still form of a young woman, her head enclosed in what appeared to be a crown of electrical contacts. Beside her, an elderly man, very much alive but clearly ill, was being prepared for the same apparatus by two assistants in pristine white coats. Dear God, Hartwell breathed. They're actually doing it. They're stealing bodies. Edmund forced himself to examine the scene with clinical detachment, though his stomach churned with disgust. The technology was beyond anything he had imagined possible, a grotesque marriage of surgical precision and electrical innovation. The young woman's chest rose and fell with mechanical regularity, maintained by the breathing apparatus connected to her throat. She's still alive, Edmund whispered, conscious but trapped. The implications struck him with full force. This was not merely murder, it was the ultimate theft, the stealing of life itself while leaving the victim aware but powerless. How many of London's elite walked the streets in stolen flesh? How many of the poor had vanished to provide vessels for the wealthy? The machinery hummed louder, beginning its terrible work. Edmund gripped his medical bag tighter, knowing they had to act before another atrocity was completed. The gaslight flickered against the curved walls of the sewer tunnel as Dr. Edmund Harwick pressed himself against the damp stone, listening for footsteps above. His heart hammered against his ribs while he clutched the leather satchel containing Dr. Pemberton's journal, the damning evidence of experiments that went far beyond what he'd witnessed in that basement laboratory. The Royal Society hadn't just been funding Pemberton's work on his wife. They'd been orchestrating a network of surgical theatres across London, each one housing subjects who'd been systematically transformed through a process that defied every natural law Edmund understood. The journal revealed locations, names, and most horrifically, the true purpose behind the grotesque modifications. Edmund's breath came in short gasps as he recalled Pemberton's final words before the constables had dragged him away. "You think you've stopped something, Harrick, but you've merely delayed the inevitable. The transformation has already begun in ways you cannot imagine." Water dripped steadily from somewhere in the darkness ahead. Edmund forced himself to move forward, following the crude map he'd sketched from memory. Lord Ashworth's estate lay directly above this section of tunnel, and according to the journal, the nobleman's private laboratory contained subjects in various stages of what Pemberton called elevation. The tunnel branched ahead, and Edmund took the leftward path, his boots splashing through inches of foul water. The smell of decay grew stronger with each step, but underneath it lurked something else, a sweet medicinal odor that made his stomach turn. He'd encountered that same smell in Pemberton's basement. A metal grating appeared in the tunnel wall, and through it, Edmund could see flickering light. He pressed his face to the bars and peered into what appeared to be a storage chamber. Glass containers lined wooden shelves, each one filled with specimens floating in preservative. But these weren't the typical anatomical samples he'd expect to find in any physician's collection. The specimens moved. Edmund's hands trembled as he watched what had once been human organs, pulsing with their own rhythm, veins branching and extending like living vines through the preservative fluid. In one container, a human heart beat steadily despite being severed from any body. In another, a brain tissue sample showed electrical activity, tiny sparks of light dancing across its surface. A door opened somewhere beyond his view, and Edmund heard footsteps approaching. He pressed himself closer to the grating, trying to see who was entering the chamber. "The Harwick problem has been contained," a familiar voice said. Edmund's blood turned to ice as he recognized Lord Ashworth's aristocratic tones. "Scotland Yard believes they've solved their mystery with Pemberton's arrest. And the doctor himself?" This second voice belonged to someone Edmund didn't recognize, though its cultured accent suggested another member of the upper classes. Still searching the sewers like a rat, no doubt. It matters little. Tonight's demonstration will proceed as planned. Edmund watched as Lord Ashworth moved into view, carrying a brass instrument that resembled a cross between surgical forceps and some kind of electrical device. Copper wires extended from its base, connecting to a larger apparatus Edmund couldn't see from his limited vantage point. "The specimens are responding beautifully," Ashworth continued, approaching one of the containers. "Pemberton's preliminary work on his wife proved the viability of the process. We can now proceed with living subjects on a much larger scale." The second man stepped into view, and Edmund barely suppressed a gasp of recognition. Dr. Marcus Thornfield, the Royal College's most celebrated anatomist and Edmund's former mentor, examined the specimens with obvious satisfaction. "The transformation of dead tissue was merely the beginning," Thornfield said, his voice carrying none of the warmth Edmund remembered from their student days together. "But tonight, we'll demonstrate that the boundary between life and death is far more malleable than conventional medicine believes." Lord Ashworth nodded toward another door at the far end of the chamber. "The subjects are prepared." 6 individuals from the workhouse reported deceased from various ailments. Their families have already been notified and arrangements made for burial. No one will think to look for them here. Edmund's grip tightened on the journal as he understood the full scope of what he was witnessing. This wasn't simply about grotesque experiments on the dead. They were planning to use their process on living people, then report them as deceased to cover their tracks. "When the demonstration concludes," Thornfield continued, "the Royal Society will have no choice but to approve full funding for our work. Imagine the applications, Ashworth. Soldiers who cannot die, labourers who require no rest, minds that can be enhanced beyond natural limitations." The 2 men moved toward the far door, and Edmund heard the sound of heavy locks being disengaged. Whatever they planned to demonstrate tonight would happen soon, and somewhere above him, 6 innocent people waited unknowingly for a fate worse than death. Edmund turned from the grating and began moving through the tunnel with renewed urgency, searching for another way into Lord Ashworth's estate. The flames consumed everything. Dr. Edmund Blackwood watched from across the street as the Royal College of Surgeons became a towering inferno against the London sky. Orange tongues licked hungrily at the Gothic windows, while black smoke billowed into the dawn air, carrying with it the acrid stench of burning flesh and chemicals. Inside those walls, decades of grotesque research were turning to ash, along with the remaining specimens that had once been human beings. He pulled his coat tighter against the morning chill, wincing as the movement aggravated the knife wound in his shoulder. Blood had soaked through the makeshift bandage, but he was alive. More than could be said for Dr. Cornelius Ashford, whose body now lay somewhere in that burning tomb. "Is it finished?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper beside him. Blackwood turned to look at the woman who had been transformed into something beyond human comprehension. Her skin still bore the faint luminescence that marked her as one of Ashford's victims, but her eyes, those were entirely her own again. The serum's hold on her mind had finally broken. "The physical evidence, yes," he replied, "but the corruption runs deeper than one building." As if summoned by his words, a carriage emerged from the smoke-filled street. Lord Pemberton stepped down, his usually immaculate appearance dishevelled. Behind him came Inspector Morrison and 2 constables, their faces grim with the knowledge of what they would not find in the ruins. "Dr. Blackwood," Pemberton called out, approaching with measured steps. "A terrible tragedy, this fire. I understand there may have been some irregularities in the college's research practices?" Irregularities. Blackwood tasted the euphemism like poison. "Is that what you call the systematic torture and transformation of human beings?" Pemberton's expression remained neutral, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Careful, Doctor. Accusations require evidence, and evidence has a tendency to disappear in fires like this." "Not all evidence," Blackwood said, patting the leather satchel at his side. Inside were Ashford's journals, rescued from the laboratory before he'd set the charges. Pages upon pages documenting not just the experiments, but the names of every patron, every government official, every member of high society who had funded or benefited from the research. The Lord's face paled slightly. "I'm sure we can reach an understanding." "The understanding," Inspector Morrison interrupted, stepping forward with manacles in hand, "is that you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, Lord Pemberton, along with accessory to kidnapping, illegal human experimentation, and about a dozen other charges that will see you hang." As the constables took Pemberton into custody, his veneer of aristocratic composure finally cracked. "You have no idea what you're destroying," he snarled. "The advancement of medical science, the betterment of humanity itself, by turning people into monsters." Sarah spoke for the first time, her transformed voice carrying an otherworldly resonance that made Pemberton flinch. "By stealing their lives, their minds, their very souls." "You are an abomination," Pemberton spat, "a perversion of nature that should be studied, not—" Morrison's fist connected with his jaw, cutting off the words. "That's enough from you." As they hauled Pemberton away, Blackwood felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, but he knew this was only the beginning. The journals contained dozens of names, and each arrest would lead to more. The conspiracy reached into Parliament, the Church, even the royal family itself. Rooting it out completely would take years. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, watching the carriage disappear into the smoky streets. "Now we rebuild," Blackwood said. "Not just the college, but everything. Medical ethics, scientific oversight, a system that values human dignity over advancement at any cost." "And what about me?" Her voice was small, vulnerable. "What about the others like me?" Blackwood turned to face her fully. In the growing daylight, her transformed features were even more pronounced. The elongated limbs, the translucent skin, the eyes that seemed to hold depths no human gaze should possess. She was beautiful and terrible, a living testament to humanity's capacity for both brilliance and horror. "You're still human, Sarah," he said firmly. "Changed, yes, but human. And as long as I draw breath, I'll work to find a way to help you and any others we discover. Not to cure you, I'm not even sure that's possible or desired, but to help you live with dignity." She smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since this nightmare began. Behind them, the fire continued to burn, consuming the last physical traces of Ashford's work. But from those ashes would come something new, a medical profession bound by ethics, guided by compassion rather than pure ambition. The age of monsters was ending. The age of healing could finally begin.